September 1739. South Carolina. The road south is narrow, the heat is thick, and the colony is pretending it controls what it built. But the first thing you have to understand is this. The most dangerous part of this story is not the march, not the guns, not even the blood. The most dangerous part is what happened afterward, what the record decided to remember, and what it trained itself to forget. Because when an institution learns that human beings can turn in unison, it does not just punish the act. It redesigns the world so the act becomes harder to imagine. And then it calls that redesign order. It calls it peace. It calls it law. The date is not vague. It is not folklore. It is Sunday, September 9, 1739. And the place is not an abstract Carolina. It is the Stono River region, along routes that point south, toward a border where the English system was terrified that its property could become people again. They will tell you this was an insurrection. They will tell you it was sudden. They will tell you it was barbarous. And yes, there were killings. There were flames. There were homes turned inside out. But the official story wants you to stop there, to freeze the moment like a warning poster. Don't ask why. Don't ask how. Don't ask what conditions could make a human being risk everything for a thin road leading into the unknown. Don't ask what kind of life makes death feel like a door instead of a wall. Don't ask. Because questions create accountability. And accountability is what the colony cannot afford. So let's begin where the buried record begins. With a discovery that is always described as if it were accidental, as if history simply happened to the powerful the way a storm happens to a ship. The Stono Uprising did not begin as a rumor. It begins in paper, in fear, in official language. A man named William Bull, Lieutenant Governor, writes a letter dated October 5th, 1739, and he tells the empire what occurred. He is not writing to mourn the dead. He is writing to explain a threat. He is writing to justify what must come next. That is what a receipt looks like in a colony. Not truth as confession, but truth as self-defense. And in that letter, and in an anonymous published account that circulates the same year, you can see the pattern forming in real time. The colony does not merely record the event. It converts it into a mandate. It turns panic into policy. Now here's the part the official story tries to soften because it complicates the moral simplicity of rebels attacked innocents. The march was not random. The direction mattered. South mattered. Because Spanish Florida existed as a living contradiction. Because St. Augustine was not just a town, it was a rumor with teeth. Because by the late 1730s, yes, before 1739, Spanish authorities had publicly offered sanctuary to fugitives who reached their territory, and Fort Mose existed as a fortified community of formerly enslaved people, proof that escape was not merely a fantasy. The colony heard that rumor the way a jail hears a key turning in the dark. It heard the possibility of bodies moving beyond control. And it responded the way institutions always respond to the possibility of losing power. It tightened the perimeter, and it trained itself to call that tightening protection. If you want to understand Stono, you must stop picturing a single outburst. You must see it as a collision between two systems of meaning. One system that counts human beings as inventory, and another system, fragile, risky, incomplete, that insists a human being can be more than a line item. The rebellion is the moment those two systems meet on a road and one of them panics. And what panics is not the plantation. What panics is the idea that the plantation can be answered. Now, the cold open you have been taught begins with a store near the Stono River. Guns. Ammunition. A first set of killings. Drums. A banner in some retellings. A word that has become legendary because it terrifies bureaucracies. Liberty. The group grows as they move, sometimes by persuasion, sometimes by coercion, sometimes because desperation has a way of recruiting without needing speeches. The colony's papers will give you numbers. 20, then more, then dozens. The colony's papers will give you categories. Negroes, slaves, insurgents. And you should notice what they do not give you. They do not give you names. Not because names didn't exist, because names are evidence of personhood. Names are evidence of claims. Names are evidence that a body is not interchangeable. The record erases names the way a butcher wipes a knife. Not to hide the cut, but to make the next cut easier. In the modern era, we can point to the region. We can point to the Stono River. We can point to roads and markers and nomination forms and interpretive plaques. We can say, this is where it began. But the closer you get to the ground, the more you feel the insult. The land is mapped more precisely than the lives. We are allowed coordinates. We are allowed signage. But the deeper archive, the one that would tell you who marched, who was forced, who fled, who died, who was executed afterward, who vanished into the swamps and never returned, remains thin, broken, or deliberately incomplete. And that is not a natural condition. That is a choice repeated over centuries. Preserve the outline, bury the interior. Preserve the story, bury the people. So in this opening, I'm not asking you to imagine a horror story. I'm telling you the horror is already in the method. A colonial society built on forced labor does not merely fear rebellion. It depends on the idea that rebellion is unthinkable. It depends on silence. Silence is not an accident. It is infrastructure. Silence is policy. Which brings us to the first split. The official story versus the missing story. The official story is clean enough to teach. A major slave uprising occurred in 1739. The militia suppressed it. The colony passed stricter laws afterward. It sounds like a contained incident with a legislative footnote. But the receipts don't let it stay clean. The receipts tell you what the colony actually learned. That the system had a weakness. That enslaved people could coordinate. That Sundays could become a vulnerability. That the border, Florida, Spain, could become a magnet. And once the colony learned that, it didn't just retaliate. It redesigned the legal environment to reduce the future human capacity to gather, to move, to communicate, to plan, to dream. If you want proof, don't look for a villain in a mask. Look for a code. Look for the year after. In 1740, South Carolina codifies a sweeping slave law, often referred to as the Negro Act of 1740, tightening restrictions on movement, assembly, education, and a long list of behaviors that in any other context would be called life. The colony uses legal language, but the function is simple. It is a manual for making the next Stono harder. This is where the story becomes prosecutorial, because it tells you intent. When a system responds to rebellion by restricting literacy, by restricting gathering, by restricting the right to earn, to travel, to organize, it is admitting what it fears most. Not violence, but autonomy. Not bloodshed, but communication. Not the gun, but the plan. The law is the confession. And it is written in the language of control because the colony cannot say what it means out loud. We are terrified you will remember you are human together. Now here is the second archive, the one the official record tries to keep out of frame. The human archive is not always written. It is carried. It is whispered. It is remembered by routes, by warnings, by names said quickly before they are taken away. It is the knowledge that Spanish Florida could mean freedom. It is the knowledge that Fort Mose existed, a real place where formerly enslaved people stood armed under a different flag, living proof that escape could turn into community, and community could turn into defense. The official archive treats this as external meddling, Spanish provocation, foreign corruption, enemy tactics. But the human archive treats it as something else. A door left open in a burning house. And now I want you to notice the moral distortion that the official story relies on. It wants you to treat freedom as sedition and bondage as normal. It wants you to treat the desire to flee as criminal, and the machinery that makes fleeing necessary as invisible. It wants you to focus on the moment of disorder, not the decades of order that were built from coerced bodies. That is the trick. And it works because paperwork is persuasive. Paper has an aura of neutrality. But paper is written by hands, and hands obey incentives. In a slave society, the incentive is always the same. Protect property, protect legitimacy, protect the fiction that what is happening is lawful and therefore moral. So when Bull writes in October 1739, and when the anonymous account circulates, you have to read them like you read a case file from a suspect who believes he is the victim. The colony portrays itself as besieged, forced to respond. It describes the event in a way that validates its next steps. It emphasizes terror, chaos, danger to settlers. It reduces the rebels to a mass. And it treats the cause, the logic of marching toward a place rumored to offer freedom, as a contaminant introduced from outside, rather than a rational response to inside conditions. This is institutional storytelling. And it is not just storytelling. It is strategy. The missing story is not merely that the enslaved had reasons. The missing story is that the colony already knew those reasons existed, and it built policies to suppress the conditions under which those reasons could become coordinated action. There is a difference between ignorance and design. Stono is design revealed. Because after Stono, the colony doesn't say, "We must treat people better." It says, "We must make people easier to control." It doesn't say, "We must address grievances." Sim. We must prevent communication. That is the moral boundary line. That is where the record indicts itself. And in this opening section, I need to be blunt about what erasure looks like. Erasure is not always burning a document. Sometimes erasure is the decision to record 20 executed without recording who. Sometimes erasure is listing owners and officials by full name while reducing the enslaved to account. Sometimes erasure is calling a human being a Negro fellow and then moving on. Erasure is also the way later commemoration works. A marker, a paragraph, a place name, a sanitized uprising, and then silence again. You can stand near the Stono River and read a sign and still not know the names of most people who marched. You can know the rebellion and still not know the dead. That is how institutions survive their own violence. They permit the outline to remain visible, because an outline without detail cannot demand reparations of memory. So here is the thesis for the hour ahead, stated plainly. The omissions in this story are not accidents. They are repeatable decisions. The colony learned from Stono, and its learning took the form of law. Its memory took the form of restriction. Its morality took the form of a code that pretends peace is something you can manufacture by eliminating movement and speech. And the modern world inherited not only the story of Stono, but the structure of its forgetting. We inherited the idea that you can acknowledge an event without accounting for the lives inside it. I am not telling you to romanticize the rebellion. I am telling you to recognize what the official archive tries to deny. That in a system where people are forced to live as property, the line between crime and resistance is written by the same hand that holds the whip. The colony wants you to treat September 9th, 1739 as a singular abnormality. But the receipts show it as a predictable eruption in a landscape engineered for suffering. And if your only response is fascination, if you consume the horror without keeping the names, the dates, the mechanisms, then you are repeating the colony's work. You are taking the event and stripping it of obligation. So we will proceed like a ledger audit. We will separate what is claimed from what is evidenced. We will hold the language up to the light. We will watch where the ink grows vague. And every time the record tries to turn a person into a number, we will treat that as a red flag, not a footnote. Because remembering is not sentiment. Remembering is accountability. And in stories like this, accountability is the one thing the archive was built to avoid. What happened on Sunday, September 9 to 1739, did not erupt out of nowhere. It landed inside a project that was already underway, an imperial project, an economic project, a legal project, with procurement, incentives, and optics. That's the part the official story prefers to keep blurred, because once you see the machinery, you stop treating Stono as an incident and start recognizing it as a predictable failure mode of a system designed to extract human labor without human consent. South Carolina in the 1730s is not simply a colony. It is a production site. It is a cash machine fueled by coerced bodies. And like any operation built on coercion, it must spend constantly on security, laws, patrols, intimidation, because the product it is manufacturing is not cotton or rice or indigo. The product is compliance. The product is silence. The product is the illusion that the enslaved will remain in place, will remain divided, will remain unarmed, will remain unnamed. Start with the incentives. The colony's leadership has two simultaneous problems in the late 1730s: labor demand and terror of labor revolt. They want maximum output and minimum movement. They want a workforce large enough to make the plantations profitable, and a surveillance regime strong enough to keep that workforce from behaving like a population. And this is not paranoia born in a vacuum. There are external pressures. Tension with Spain, the proximity of Spanish Florida, and the fact that sanctuary is not just an idea but a rumor the enslaved can act upon. By 1738, Fort Mose exists as a fortified free black settlement allied to Spain near St. Augustine. That is not a metaphor. That is not hearsay. That is a geopolitical fact with psychological consequences. It tells the enslaved, there is a place in this world where your status can change. And it tells the slaveholding colony, your inventory can walk away and return as soldiers under a rival flag. That's why Stono cannot be understood as a local disturbance. It is a borderland panic. It is the nightmare of property turning into people at the edge of empire. Now look at how the colony procures security. They don't call it that. They call it public safety. They call it order. They write acts and directives that sound like communal responsibility, but function like forced vigilance. In 1739, before Stono, South Carolina has already passed measures requiring white men to be armed in public contexts, including a church. Let that land. The colony is so aware of its own instability that it treats Sunday worship, supposedly the civilized heartbeat of their society, as a security risk requiring firearms. That is not normal community defense. That is a confession of fear. And it also tells you something else. The colony already understands that time and ritual can become cover. That a day with movement and gathering and reduced supervision can become an opening. The project is already running. Reduce openings, increase deterrence, normalize intimidation as civic virtue. There's another procurement layer. Information control. The colony's leadership understands that narrative is a tool. When William Bull writes on October 5th, 1739, he is not merely reporting. He is packaging. He is shaping the event into a story that justifies increased control and requests legitimacy from above. That letter is not a diary. It is an administrative defense memo aimed upward at imperial authority. And the anonymous account of the Negro insurrection that circulates in 1739 functions the same way. It frames the rebellion through lenses that serve the colony: foreign influence, criminality, threat, while keeping the enslaved as a faceless mass. When the record is produced by those who benefit from the system, the paper trail does not just document. It disciplines. It teaches the reader how to feel. It directs outrage away from the structure and toward the symptoms. This is the elegant solution leadership reaches for whenever a coercive system trembles. Not reform, but refinement. Not humanization, but optimization. When an institution fears revolt, it does not ask how to make life bearable. It asks how to make revolt harder. It asks how to turn coordination into isolation. How to turn memory into amnesia. How to turn language into risk. How to turn mobility into a crime. And because the colony can't admit its moral failure, it translates these objectives into administrative language. Regulation, restriction, governance, discipline. Words that sound neutral. Words that hide violence behind syntax. Now we move from the project to the workforce, the human engine the colony is trying to control, and we watch how the language of erasure does the real work. Because you cannot enslave people at scale without also enslaving the record. The record must be managed. The record must be trained to see certain people as fully legible and other people as interchangeable. That's why, when you read the surviving accounts, you get a cruel clarity. The colony remembers itself in detail. It remembers its officials. It remembers its property. It remembers its fear. But it refuses to remember the enslaved as individuals unless it is forced to, unless naming them becomes useful for punishment or deterrence. Consider what we know about the participants of Stono. The official and semi-official narratives often preserve a leader's name, Jemmy, sometimes identified as Cato in later traditions, because leadership is a convenient story shape. A single name makes the uprising look like a plot driven by a ringleader, rather than a collective rupture driven by conditions. A named leader is useful. It turns structural violence into a criminal conspiracy. It makes the colony the victim of a villain, instead of the author of a system. But beyond that, the names dissolve. The record shifts into numbers and categories. A party of Negroes. A number of them. Many killed. Some taken. This is not because the colony lacked paperwork. Slave societies are paperwork factories. The point is not that they could not record names. The point is that they chose not to treat those names as worth preserving. And that choice is a moral act. Watch the asymmetry. Colonial officials and prominent white figures are fully identified. Their titles are intact. Their social presence survives as ink. The enslaved appear as hands, Negroes, slaves, runaways, insurgents. Even when the rebellion is described in detail, its route, its actions, its danger, the people inside it are stripped of personal identity. This is what erasure looks like at the administrative level. You reduce human beings to a type, then you punish the type, then you legislate against the type. The person disappears, the category remains. And once the category remains, cruelty can become repeatable, scalable, procedural. The colony doesn't need to hate each individual. It only needs to maintain the category slave as a permanent condition. Language makes permanence possible. Now bring in the micro-portraits, because they are not decoration. They are evidence that the humanity existed and the record chose to hide it. First, William Bull. Not because he is sympathetic, he isn't the point. Because he represents the colonial mind in motion. He sees the uprising as a threat to order and property, and his letter becomes a conduit through which panic turns into policy. He is the witness with leverage. He writes what will be read. He writes what will be believed. And because he is powerful, his words become a cornerstone of official memory. That is how official archives are built. Not by truth rising naturally to the surface, but by power selecting which truth survives. Second, the figure of Jemmy/Cato, the named face the record preserves. Even here, notice the manipulation. The record is confident about the danger, less precise about the man. Leadership becomes a label. A named ringleader lets the colony pretend the revolt is the work of a few corrupting influences rather than the predictable outcome of a brutal system. When you see a single name repeated while dozens of others vanish, you should hear the record confessing. We need you to focus on the man, not the machine. Third, Fort Mose. A place, not a person. Yet, in this story, it functions like a living witness. By 1738, it stands as a Spanish-allied community of free black people near St. Augustine. That fact matters because it proves motive is not speculative. It proves the march south is not irrational. The colony's papers can frame Spanish freedom offers as propaganda, but the existence of Fort Mose makes that framing weaker. It is harder to dismiss escape as delusion when a fortified refuge exists. Fort Mose is a silent document. Its walls argue with the colony's narrative. It tells us the enslaved were operating within a real geopolitical landscape, making strategic decisions under the constraints of terror. And that is precisely the kind of knowledge the official story wants to dilute, because it makes the rebellion legible as purpose rather than madness. Now, return to the colony's workforce recording practices. How are people written down? Often as first names only, or as owner's property, or as numbers. This is not mere insult. It's operational necessity. If you want to treat people as replaceable inputs, your records must reflect replaceability. Your records must facilitate substitution. And substitution is exactly what terror systems require. If one person dies, another is purchased. If one person flees, another is imported. If one person rebels, another is whipped into obedience. The machine demands a steady flow of bodies. So the record becomes a conveyor belt. Counts, categories, transactions, anything but personhood. Anything but a trace that could later stand as testimony. And here is the prosecutorial point that must be stated clearly. The rebellion did not teach the colony to become cruel. The colony was already cruel. What Stono taught the colony was how to formalize cruelty more completely. To take practices already embedded in daily life and convert them into comprehensive law. To reduce the gray areas where enslaved people might gather, speak, travel, learn, earn. To remove options. to narrow the world until movement becomes suspicious by default. That is why the year 1740 matters so much. Because the legal response is not merely retaliation, it is an institutional redesign. It is the colony writing down, in official form, the steps necessary to keep a population from becoming a community. And we cannot pretend this is purely historical, because the same method governs how the story has been preserved. Modern commemoration often keeps Stono at the level of event. A marker. A paragraph. A story of fear and suppression. But the same old erasure repeats. The land is mapped, the date is remembered, the colonial officials are named, and the people who marched are still mostly swallowed by the phrase Negroes. That continuity is not an accident of time. It is the afterlife of a record designed to protect reputation at the cost of human accounting. So as we move forward, keep the governing idea in mind. Stono is not just about what happened on September 9th, 1739. It is about what the colony decided to do with what happened. It is about the conversion of fear into paperwork, paperwork into law, law into everyday reality. It is about a workforce turned into a category, and a category used as permission for control. And it is about the moral responsibility that falls on anyone who inherits the story. If you repeat the colony's language without challenging it, if you say insurrection without asking what conditions produced it, then you are not neutral. You are participating. You are helping the old machine run. Because the true project here was never just rice or indigo or wealth. The true project was building a world where some people could live comfortably without ever having to acknowledge the people crushed beneath them. A world where violence could be described as discipline. A world where human desire for freedom could be described as criminal agitation. A world where silence could be praised as peace. That is the project that Stono exposed. And the colony's response, armed worship requirements, then the tightening of the code, shows you exactly what it valued. Not lives. Not truth. Not justice. It valued control. And it was willing to rewrite the rules of human existence to keep it. The colony's surviving paperwork will never sit you down and say, plainly, this is what we did to them every day. It won't describe the cramped quarters, the hunger calibrated just below collapse, the tools that break skin before they break wood, the fevers that run through cabins like a second set of chains, the punishments administered as routine maintenance. It won't, because a slave society cannot afford to narrate itself honestly. It can only narrate outcomes. Productivity, compliance, order restored. So if you want the daily conditions, you have to read the negative space. You have to study what the later laws try to prevent, because law is where the system admits what it fears. And in South Carolina, the fear is always the same. Movement, gathering, communication, humans behaving like humans together. That's why, when Stono happens on September 9th, 1739, it's not merely treated as violence. It's treated as proof that the enslaved had time, proximity, and enough shared language to coordinate. The colony's response is a map of the conditions it wants to erase. It restricts assembly because assembly is how people become a community. It restricts travel because travel is how people become difficult to cage. It restricts literacy because literacy is how memory becomes portable. It restricts earning and trading because money is how options become real. In other words, the colony's legal aftershock tells you what life already looked like. A world where even the smallest expressions of agency had to be kept precarious, punishable, reversible. So let's talk about the daily reality the paperwork refuses to describe. In a plantation colony, the enslaved are not just labor, they are a managed risk. The system does not merely extract work, it must constantly manage despair, Because despair produces flight, and flight produces panic, and panic produces costs. Housing is not designed for dignity, it is designed for containment. Food is not designed for health, it is designed for minimum function. Rest is not designed for recovery, it is designed for next day output. Tools are allocated the way you allocate to livestock. Enough to keep the work moving, not enough to keep bodies safe. Injury is treated like waste. Sickness is treated like inconvenience. Death is treated like replacement scheduling. And because this is a society that calculates human beings as inventory, even compassion becomes suspect. Mercy is a crack. A crack can become an opening. The colony learns to seal openings. Now bring in the outsider witness voice, not a sentimental witness, not a moral hero, but the kind of person institutions always rely on. A supervisor's tone, an official's tone, a man writing to another man with power. William Bull's letter dated October 5th, 1739 is not a memoir. It is a report. It treats the uprising as a breach that must be explained, framed, and closed. Read that tone carefully. It does not linger on the enslaved as people. It lingers on the event as a security failure. That is how an institution sees suffering. It is not tragedy. It is a variable. And if you listen for what is missing, you can hear it anyway. The colony did not need to invent cruelty after Stono, because cruelty was already the normal condition. What Stono did was force cruelty to admit itself. It forced the system to speak about its own fragility. The first major incident, as the record tells it, is not a tragedy. It's a breach. On Sunday, September 9, 1739, a group, often described as roughly 20 at the start, converges near the Stono River region, near a store by the bridge where arms and ammunition are kept. This detail is important because it's practical, not symbolic. People who have never planned anything do not begin by acquiring guns and powder. People who are merely rioting do not select a target that changes the balance of power. The group seizes weapons. People are killed in that initial strike. The march begins. And you will hear, in many retellings, the idea of drums, of a banner, of the word liberty spoken aloud. Whether every detail survives cleanly is less important than what the colony itself could not deny. That the movement had direction, momentum, and recruitment. The group does not disperse. It grows. That growth terrifies the colony more than the killings do, because growth proves possibility. It proves that the enslaved were not isolated atoms. It proves there was a social network the system had failed to crush. Now, daily conditions are what make that possibility combustible. The colony's papers might call them slaves, but daily life is what turns that word into a lived reality. Fatigue, surveillance, arbitrary violence, sexual coercion, family separation, punishment as spectacle, and the constant awareness that your body is an asset managed by someone else. Don't romanticize rebellion, but don't insult it either by pretending it comes from nothing. When a person risks death to run, it is because staying is a slow death with paperwork attached. When a group risks everything to march, it is because the present is already unlivable, and the future is already stolen. The colony tries to deny this logic by framing Stono as foreign instigated, Spanish proclamations, external seduction. But the existence of Spanish Florida as refuge only matters because the English system is unbearable. A door only becomes irresistible when the room is a trap. And here's the crucial administrative maneuver. Minimization. The paperwork minimizes the daily cruelty by refusing to describe it, and it minimizes the uprising by describing it as an aberration rather than a consequence. The record will emphasize disorder because disorder is easier to condemn than structure. It will emphasize violence against settlers because those deaths can be individualized and mourned within the colony's moral framework. But it will treat Black Death as a total, a tally, an outcome of necessary measures. This is not incidental. This is the moral architecture of a slave society. Some deaths are tragedies. Other deaths are housekeeping. Now we transition into the first vanishings, the part that separates a mere historical recap from a buried record narrative. Because after a crisis like Stono, there are always two stories. The story of the event and the story of what happens to the people afterward. The event is loud. The aftermath is where institutions do their quiet work. And the quiet work is where the archive becomes dangerous. Not because it screams, because it smooths. What are vanishings in a slave colony context? They're not always mysterious disappearances in the modern crime story sense. They can be far more ordinary, which is what makes them more horrifying. A vanishing can be a name that never enters the record. A vanishing can be a person reduced to a number and then erased by the word executed. A vanishing can be a line crossed out, a tally adjusted, a replacement purchased, a brief note, sent away, removed, disposed. In Stono's case, we have a public event and a thin accounting of the human aftermath. We hear that many were killed in the suppression and many were executed afterward. We hear numbers that vary across tellings. We hear the colony's urgency to restore peace. But what we do not get, in most surviving official phrasing, is what a morally accountable society would demand. Who, specifically, was killed? Who was captured? Who was executed? Where were they buried? What was done with bodies? What was done with survivors? What was done with the people who were forced into the march or coerced into joining? The record does not answer cleanly because clean answers create obligations. Obligations create consequences. So the record learns to be vague in the places where vagueness protects power. This is where the substitutions in the ledger motif becomes more than metaphor. In a slave society, the ledger is not just accounting, it is ontology. It decides what counts as real. It converts a person into property and then treats the conversion as natural. And because that ledger is built for transactions, it is also built for substitutions. One body replaced by another. One name replaced by a number. One line crossed out and rewritten. The paper trail is designed to keep labor continuous even when life is interrupted. That's why rebellions are such a threat. They interrupt continuity. They create a gap that the ledger cannot easily smooth over without revealing the violence that powers it. So look at the anomaly Stono forces into view. An event large enough that it must be reported upward, yet human enough that it should produce a thick trail of names, and it doesn't. We can identify William Bull because he writes. We can often identify a leader's name because the colony wants a villain label. But dozens of participants and victims remain submerged. And that is not just a missing detail, it is a repeated pattern of erasure. Privileged people are recorded as individuals. Disposable people are recorded as totals. This is how the system protects itself from the moral weight of its own actions. It prevents the dead from becoming a list that can be read aloud. Now present the repeating record anomalies the way an investigator would, because that is the tone this story demands. First anomaly: the heavy reliance on aggregate numbers. When a document gives you totals instead of names, it is telling you what the institution values. It values the scale of the threat, not the identity of the threatened. Second anomaly: euphemistic conclusions. Killed, disposed, executed, suppressed, Verbs that describe outcomes without describing process. A death can be acknowledged without describing the manner, without acknowledging the cruelty, without naming the person, without locating the remains. Third anomaly. Asymmetrical specificity. You will often find that white casualties and property damage are described with sharper detail than black losses, because detail is reserved for what the colony mourns and what it can politically leverage. Black death is recorded as a solution. White death is recorded as a crime. That difference is the moral signature of the archive. Now build the inference carefully, because credibility in this genre comes from restraint paired with insistence. I am not going to pretend we possess a perfect roster of every participant. The point is we don't, and we should ask why we don't. The colony had the capacity to produce lists when lists served it. It could produce rolls, inventories, patrol logs, legal acts. The absence of a full human accounting in the places where it would create moral pressure is, itself, evidence of procedure. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is work. And now we arrive at the question that creates danger, the question the colony spent decades training itself to avoid. Where did they go? Not just where did the march go? Where did the people go after capture, after suppression, after execution? Where are the bodies? Where are the names? Where is the human remainder of an event the colony insists on remembering only as threat? Because if you can't name the dead, you can't honor them. If you can't locate them, you can't mourn them. If you can't account for them, you can't prosecute what was done to them, not legally, not morally, not historically. And that is the point. A slave society is a society that relies on the dead staying anonymous. The moral teaching here is simple, and it is not comfortable. History is not only what happened. History is what a society is willing to count. In 1739, South Carolina counted enslaved people as property. When Stono broke the surface, the colony counted the uprising as a security emergency. When it moved to erase the aftermath, it stopped counting the people as people again. And every time we repeat the story of Stono without insisting on the missing human ledger, without demanding the names, the fates, the burials, the exact mechanisms of suppression, we are allowing the colony's accounting system to govern our memory. That is how institutions win long after the gunfire ends. They teach the future what not to ask. So in this section, don't let the colony's paperwork set the emotional boundaries. Don't let insurrection do the work of explanation. Don't let totals replace lives. The conditions were designed to break people into silence. Stono is what happens when silence fails. And the vanishings afterward are what happens when the system repairs itself, not by telling the truth, but by making truth too thin to hold. Sunday, September 9, 1739 is the kind of date a slave society tries to sand down until it feels like folklore, something you can mention without feeling indicted. But the closer you look, the less it behaves like a spontaneous riot and the more it reads like a crisis window the system itself created. A predictable spike where the colony's habits, Sunday movement, reduced supervision, routine access points, collided with a population that had reasons, roots, and a horizon. This is the part where the archive becomes most dishonest, because it wants you to see chaos without seeing structure. It wants you to see violence without seeing the long administrative violence that made violence feel like a tool. It wants you to believe the day was an inexplicable fever. But the receipts describe something colder. A sequence of decisions, exploited weaknesses, and a rapid institutional response that reveals what the colony truly valued. Not human life. Not truth. Control. And on that Sunday, control briefly slipped. The colony never forgave the enslaved for proving that it could. The mourning begins near the Stono River region in South Carolina, A place that seems quiet on a map, but sits inside a network of roads that mattered. Roads that led past plantations, past stores, past fields, toward the idea of South, toward Spanish Florida, toward Street, Augustine, toward a rumor that had become real enough to kill for. Sanctuary. By 1738, Fort Mose existed near St. Augustine as a fortified free black community aligned with Spain. Whether every marcher knew the details is not the point. The point is that the possibility had weight. And in a slave society, possibility is contraband. On September 9th, that contraband moved. The initial group, often described as about 20 at the outset, does not begin by begging. It begins by arming itself. It targets a store near the bridge, a practical choice because guns and powder change the meaning of a body in a system designed to treat bodies as livestock. That first act is a declaration. We will not be chased like animals. We will be fought like an enemy. And that is exactly how the colony responds. Because the colony understands, even if it pretends not to, that enslaved people acting together are not criminals. They are a political threat to the entire architecture of ownership. There are killings at the beginning. The archive is more comfortable describing these deaths than describing why the deaths were possible. It will stress brutality. It will stress shock. It will stress alarm. But it does not stress the daily brutality that preceded the alarm. That omission is not forgetfulness. It is strategy. Because if you admit the background, you admit causality. If you admit causality, you admit responsibility. And responsibility is what the colony spent its existence evading. The march begins. This is not a scattered flight of individuals. It is a moving formation, a rolling rupture. Along the route, the group grows, some joining willingly, some coerced, some caught in the current because indecision is a luxury enslaved people often do not have. The colony's reports describe recruitment as criminal contagion, as if courage spreads like plague. But ask yourself why so many would gamble on a road that almost certainly ended in death. Ask yourself what kind of life makes the risk of immediate death rational. The answer is not romance. The answer is the mathematics of survival inside bondage. When tomorrow offers only more containment, even a thin chance becomes a strategy. And the route's direction matters. South matters because it is the one direction where the enslaved could imagine a competing jurisdiction, an enemy of the English system. The colony would later talk about Spanish influence as if it were a demonic whisper. But Spanish Florida did not create the desire to be free. It merely proved that the desire could sometimes find a legal cover. It put a sign on a door the enslaved had already been trying to locate. As the march advances, the colony's nervous system activates. Riders, warnings, militia mobilization. This is where William Bull enters the record as more than a person. He becomes a hinge. He encounters the group during the day and escapes to raise the alarm. That detail matters, not because Bull is the protagonist, but because the archive elevates him as a reliable witness precisely because he is powerful. His survival becomes a narrative asset. His voice becomes the colony's voice. He will write upward. He will justify. He will shape meaning. And the pattern is immediate. As soon as the colony hears, it responds with force. That force is not improvised heroism. It is the reflex of a system that has rehearsed violence as governance. The militia confronts the marchers. There is fighting. There is suppression. And then there is the part the colony wanted most. The restoration of order. Achieved not by addressing causes, but by erasing the people who proved the system could be challenged. The crisis window does not end when the fighting ends. It intensifies afterward in the quieter phase. Capture, punishment, execution, display. Slave societies often convert punishment into theater because theater disciplines the living. You do not need every gruesome detail to understand the mechanism. The mechanism is always the same. Make an example, destroy hope, and then legislate hope out of existence. This is why the colony's legislative response matters as much as the gunfire. Because the colony learns from the day, and it writes what it learned into law. Before Stono, the colony already had measures requiring white men to be armed at church, a revealing admission that even worship was treated as a security vulnerability. After Stono, that mentality hardens. By 1740, South Carolina codifies a sweeping slave law that tightens control over movement, assembly, and communication. That year is not a footnote. It is the institutional statement. We will not allow the conditions that made September 9th possible. But listen to what that means. It does not mean we will reduce cruelty. It means we will reduce opportunity. And opportunity, in this context, is simply the ability to gather, to plan, to move, to think, to remember, to speak. The law becomes an operating manual for preventing the next collective act of humanity. That is why I'm telling you the crisis window is not just a day. It is a diagnostic moment, like a structural crack revealed under pressure. The crack is social. The crack is moral. The crack is that enslaved people were a population, not a set of isolated bodies. Stono proved that populations can coordinate. It proved that even under surveillance, even under terror, people can find each other. And the colony's reaction proves it understood exactly what had happened. If you want to hear the colony admit it without meaning to, you listen for the sudden spike in language about prevention, security, restraint, discipline. Those words are not neutral. They are the vocabulary of fear dressed as governance. This is the moment where the narrator's voice must shift, not into melodrama, but into a colder certainty, because the record itself provides the admission. I wish I could tell you this part is speculation. It isn't. The colony wrote down its panic, and then it turned panic into procedure. The receipts do not allow innocence. Now we move into the confrontation letters, the point where power demands answers, and the institution is forced to respond with words precise enough to incriminate itself while vague enough to protect itself. In a slave colony, truth is rarely offered freely. It is extracted under pressure. This is where people misunderstand archives. They imagine archives are where the past is preserved. In reality, archives are often where institutions negotiate what they can afford to admit. The most important documents in this story are not heartfelt confessions. They are defensive communications sent to those with leverage. Superiors, officials, authorities who can demand explanations. William Bull's letter dated October 5th, 1739 is exactly that. It is not a lament. It is a report meant for an imperial audience. It carries an implicit plea. We faced a threat. We responded. We need approval. We need support. We need our tightening measures to be understood as necessary. When a regime writes upward, it reveals what it believes will persuade. Bull emphasizes danger, scale, urgency. He frames the uprising as a security crisis, not as a moral reckoning. And in doing so, he gives us a rare thing, a view of the colony's mind under stress. He shows you the colony is not confused about what happened. It is afraid of what happened. It is afraid because it recognizes organization. It recognizes intention. It recognizes that the enslaved were not merely suffering, they were acting. And that recognition is fatal to the ideology of slavery, which requires the enslaved to be imagined as naturally subordinate, naturally compliant, naturally fragmented. Stono shattered that fantasy in public. The letter is part of the repair. But confrontation letters are not only what officials write upward. They are also what owners and stakeholders demand laterally, privately, quietly, the questions that threaten the smooth functioning of the property system. When a rebellion sweeps through plantations and roads, owners want to know who was taken, who was killed, what property was damaged, what compensation will be offered, what measures will prevent recurrence. They may not ask for justice, but they ask for accounting. Accounting is the language of a slave society because accounting is where morality goes to die. Return them. Prove where they are. Explain losses. The archive rarely preserves every such demand, but the pattern is visible in how the institution replies. Quickly, defensively, vaguely. And that vagueness is the tell. If everything were clean, the answers would be clean. But mass violence does not produce clean paperwork unless someone cleans it. And cleaning, here, is a euphemism for concealment. Here is what admission under pressure looks like. The institution may concede that many were killed or executed, but it offers few particulars. It may concede the rebellion scale, but it blurs individual identities. It may concede the need for new controls, and that concession is itself an admission. The previous controls were insufficient. The colony would prefer a story where the uprising was an alien infection, Spanish provocation, because that preserves the moral legitimacy of slavery as normal. But the need to tighten laws in 1740 betrays the truth. The system's normal state was unstable enough that it required constant escalation. That is not governance. That is containment. Confrontation letters also reveal another institutional habit: the conversion of human beings into problems to be solved. When officials correspond about Stono, the underlying question is never, what did we do to them? The question is, how do we prevent this from happening again? That seems like a neutral security question until you remember what prevention means in a slave society. It does not mean improving conditions. It means restricting life. It means criminalizing gathering. It means limiting travel. It means limiting speech. It means turning literacy into suspicion. It means turning drums into contraband. It means turning community into a crime. This is why the confrontation letters matter. Because they show that the colony's primary goal was not to restore peace as an ethical condition. It was to restore peace as an operational condition. Uninterrupted labor, uninterrupted property relations, uninterrupted hierarchy. Peace, in this system, is simply violence working smoothly enough that it doesn't need to be spoken about. And once you see that, you can no longer treat the letter as a neutral report. You see it as an artifact of an institution saving itself. And you begin to understand the larger pattern. Official archives remember what protects power and forget what burdens it. That's why Stono remains, even now, a story with a famous name and a thin roster. The colony preserved the outline, date, danger, suppression, because the outline justifies the system's self-image as besieged and righteous. But it did not preserve the interior, the full identities, the full fates, the full human accounting, because the interior would create obligations. Mourning, acknowledgement, shame, accountability. And accountability is precisely what slave societies train themselves to avoid. So let me state the moral instruction plainly, because this is where your responsibility as a listener begins. When you accept the colony's wording, you inherit the colony's priorities. When you repeat insurrection without interrogating the machinery that produced it, you become a courier for the very silence the colony engineered. Confrontation letters show us that truth is rarely volunteered. It is extracted when someone with power demands it. But the dead had no leverage. The dead could not write letters. The dead could not demand names. And so the system learned that the dead could be dissolved into totals. That is why we must do what the archive refused. Insist that totals are not a substitute for people. Insist that a date is not a substitute for a life. Insist that order restored is not a substitute for justice. On September 9th, 1739, the colony's system of silence cracked. By October 5th, 1739, the colony was already sealing the crack with narrative. By 1740, it would seal it with law. That is the arc from crisis to procedure. And if you want to understand the true horror of Stono, it isn't only the blood on the road. It's the speed with which the institution transformed blood into bureaucracy, so that future blood could be spilled more quietly, with cleaner paperwork, and fewer names left behind. After Stono, the colony did not merely punish. It standardized. That is the difference between a massacre and a system. A massacre can be denied as excess. A system cannot survive without making excess feel like routine. This is where silence as policy stops being a motif and becomes a manual. Because once an institution realizes that truth itself can trigger unrest, once it realizes that names, stories, and visible burial can create memory, and memory can create solidarity, it begins to manage not just bodies, but knowledge. And South Carolina, in the years immediately following September 9th, 1739, becomes a case study in how a slave society upgrades itself. Euphemisms to launder cruelty, missing pages to protect reputations, procedures to distribute guilt so no single hand looks bloody, and legislation to make the next rebellion not only punishable, but less imaginable. Start with the cover-up mechanism that is most misunderstood. It isn't always a secret meeting. It isn't always a locked room. Most often, it is a routine file that makes brutality sound like administration. When Stono is described in surviving accounts, you see a kind of controlled language. Insurrection, alarm, suppressed, executed. Verbs that conclude. Verbs that do not narrate process. Verbs that allow the reader to accept the outcome without picturing the method. That is euphemism as anesthesia. The colony does not need to hide that people died. It needs to hide how they died, how many, and what was done with the bodies afterward. Because bodies are evidence. Bodies make the past physical. Bodies force questions like, where were they put? Who handled them? Who signed off? Who watched? Who profited? A slave society can tolerate death. It cannot tolerate a visible accounting of death, because accounting produces moral pressure. So the colony leans on language that acknowledges just enough to close the file and then moves on. And then comes the true procedure. The law. By 1740, South Carolina codifies a sweeping slave code, the Negro Act, restricting movement, assembly, earning, and other forms of autonomy. You can call it legislation, but functionally it is a suppression protocol written as civic order. The colony wraps it in the language of safety, as if the problem is violence rather than bondage, as if the solution is restriction rather than justice. This is where silence becomes procedure. Because the code does not just punish acts, It criminalizes the conditions under which acts become possible. It targets gathering. It targets travel. It targets communication. It targets the ability to form networks. In plain terms, it targets the infrastructure of community. A society does not write such a law if it believes enslaved people are merely passive labor. It writes such a law because Stono proved otherwise. The law is the colony admitting, in its own hand, they can organize. We must prevent organization. That admission is one of the most damning receipts you will ever see, because it reveals intent without needing confession. Now look at how this mechanism distributes responsibility. A cover-up is rarely a single villain shredding paper. It's many people doing their assigned tasks, each one small enough to feel excusable, each one framed as duty. One official writes a report upward in October 1739, minimizing detail and emphasizing threat. Another clerk copies it. Another printer circulates an account that preserves the colony's narrative. Legislators draft restrictions and call them good government. Patrols enforce the restrictions and call it security. Ministers preach obedience and call it order. Owners applaud and call it stability. No cape. No theatrical mastermind. Just a machine that converts fear into bureaucracy. That is how institutions achieve silence. Not by preventing every voice, but by ensuring that no voice has to take full responsibility. The cruelty is shared, therefore it is disowned. Everyone participates, therefore no one feels guilty enough to stop. This is also where the archive begins to lose pages in a very particular way. Not necessarily through fire, not necessarily through dramatic destruction, but through selective preservation. The colony preserves what it needs for legitimacy: laws, official correspondence, public-facing narratives, and it allows other materials to vanish. Lists of the executed, precise burial records, full rosters of those captured, informal communications that might reveal uglier motives. This is the bureaucratic version of cleaning a crime scene. You leave the furniture. You remove the stains. You keep the building. You erase the smell. And then you tell the world, with a straight face, that the building is historic while refusing to say what happened inside it. Now I want you to notice something about the missing pages phenomenon. It is not always intentional sabotage. Sometimes it is simply the predictable result of whose paperwork is considered important. Officials' papers are archived because officials are history. Enslaved people's testimonies aren't archived because enslaved people are treated as noise. That is how power shapes survival of evidence. But after Stono, there is an additional pressure. Evidence that could humanize the rebels is dangerous. Evidence that could clarify motive is dangerous. Evidence that could reveal coordination is dangerous. So even if no one says, out loud, destroy this, the incentive structure itself functions like a shredder. People learn what not to keep. This is where we pivot into the second discovery, decades later, because every buried record story has a repeating choice. The same decision made in 1739 and 1740 repeats later under a different vocabulary. Don't disturb, don't excavate, don't publicize, don't complicate. Time passes. Empires change flags. Governments rename themselves. But institutions keep their habits. They do not like disturbances that expose foundations. They especially do not like disturbances that force them to acknowledge that their heritage includes controlled brutality and unmarked death. So Stono becomes a story that can be referenced, but not fully accounted for. A symbol, but not a ledger. Jump forward, not to a single year of discovery, but to a long, uncomfortable modern truth. The physical site associated with the beginning of Stono is not treated like a sacred archive of human lives. It is treated, too often, like an inconvenient reminder. The story survives in historical memory and scholarship. The date survives. September 9th, 1739. The name survives. Stono. But the ground where it began becomes contested, neglected, reduced to plaques and nominations and interpretation, the modern euphemism that lets institutions acknowledge without truly reckoning. The second discovery is this. Even when we know where something happened, we still replicate the old erasure by failing to preserve it with urgency, failing to fund it with seriousness, failing to treat it like a crime scene that never stopped mattering. You see the pattern in how modern documentation works. There are nomination forms, registers, historical markers, small blocks of text that summarize the event as a rebellion and gesture toward aftermath. These documents serve a function. They certify significance. They put a stamp on memory. But they can also act like a lid. They can become the official substitute for deeper accounting, the way a short obituary can replace a life. The institution says, "We have marked it. We have recorded it." And the public is trained to accept the marker as closure. But closure without names is not closure. It's containment. It is the colony's method wearing a modern suit. And then, sometimes, in later decades, someone finds something, an old note, a private file, a reference that doesn't align, a location description that points to a different spot, an overlooked line in a 19th century retelling that mentions a store, a bridge, a creek. This is how second discoveries happen in real life. Not with a cinematic reveal, but with tedious cross-checking that exposes inconsistencies. The same way an auditor finds fraud, not by a confession, but by a mismatch. Stono's story is full of mismatches. The event is famous, but the individual participants are not. The aftermath is described, but the precise accounting is thin. The motive is implied, but often sanitized. The geographic origin is cited, but the site's preservation history is uneven. Those are not just scholarly frustrations. Those are symptoms of an older choice. Keep the story as a warning, not as a memorial. In a buried record narrative, the second discovery is also about repetition. When modern officials and institutions confront uncomfortable evidence, whether it's a site that demands protection or documentation that demands deeper interpretation, they face the same fork the colony faced. Reveal fully or manage quietly. Investigate or stabilize. Excavate truth or preserve comfort. And again, the easiest path is chosen. Manage. Stabilize. Minimize disturbance. In 1739, they managed with bullets and executions. In 1740, they managed with law. In the modern era, they manage with committees, funding decisions, land use, and the slow violence of neglect. The mechanism changes. The outcome rhymes. The human archive stays fragmented. This is why the second discovery matters morally. Because it shows you the continuity of institutional behavior across centuries. The original cover-up mechanism, euphemisms, missing names, procedural suppression, was not sealed in amber. It became a cultural habit. It trained generations to treat Black suffering as a historical background rather than a ledger of individuals. It trained the public to accept a rebellion happened as sufficient memory. It trained us to speak the event's name while forgetting the people inside it. That is the true reburial. Not only of bodies, but of accountability. So what exactly is found and buried again in the Stono context? Sometimes it is literal, site remnants identified. then left without robust protection. Sometimes it is documentary, a paper trail that suggests deeper complexities, then compressed into a simplified summary. Sometimes it is interpretive, a scholar's argument about motive and context, then watered down in public retellings into a morality play about violence. The same pattern. Discovery, then containment. Discovery, then smoothing. Discovery, then a public-facing version that can be consumed without discomfort. The old mechanism was a slave code. The new mechanism is a heritage brochure. Different tools, same intent. Regulate what people are allowed to know. And here is the key line you need to carry into the next section of the film. Institutions do not only hide evidence, they also manufacture substitutes. A marker becomes a substitute for a list of names. A register nomination becomes a substitute for a grave. A paragraph becomes a substitute for a life. A date becomes a substitute for accountability. Substitutes are how a society convinces itself it has remembered when it has only referenced. Referencing is not remembering. Remembering is reconstructing what was made to vanish and refusing to let comfort dictate the limits of truth. So when you hear the phrase, silence is policy, understand it as a chain of procedures. Euphemize, aggregate, omit, normalize, legislate, commemorate lightly, neglect, and call the neglect unfortunate rather than intentional. This is the cover-up mechanism from 1739 into the modern era. And the second discovery is the moment you realize that the story is still being managed. Not with whips, but with budgets. Not with patrols, but with interpretation. Not with public executions, but with the quiet refusal to treat the ground as sacred evidence. This is where the moral instruction tightens, because it is not enough to condemn the past. A story like Stono tests the present. It asks, will you accept the colony's methods with updated vocabulary, or will you insist on full accounting? Will you be satisfied with a monument, or will you demand the ledger? Because the true horror is not that Stono happened. The true horror is that, after it happened, the world built systems to ensure it would be remembered in the least threatening way possible. And unless we interrupt that pattern, unless we treat missing names as a scandal, missing records as an indictment, neglected sites as a continuing crime, we become the final link in the chain of silence. There is a point in every buried record story where the institution stops relying on force and starts relying on fragmentation. It learns that you don't always have to destroy evidence to neutralize it. You can simply scatter it. You can make it expensive to gather. You can make it socially risky to publish. You can make funding contingent on silence. You can make access contingent on tone. And then, when someone finally assembles the pieces into a coherent accusation, you don't have to arrest them. You just have to tell them, softly, that their career depends on being responsible. That word, responsible, is one of the most effective weapons ever invented, because it sounds like virtue while operating like a muzzle. This is where the private archive enters. Diaries, boxes, side notes, drafts, unpublished chapters, and the kind of evidence that survives only because someone had the moral stubbornness to keep what the official record did not want to carry. For Stono, the private archive begins with the obvious receipts. The October 5th, 1739 letter from Lieutenant Governor William Bull, and the anonymous 1739 printed account of the Negro insurrection. Those documents are not hidden. They exist in public collections. But here is the trick. Having documents exist is not the same as having them function. A record can be available and still be politically inert if it is not assembled into an indictment. Institutions can tolerate isolated facts. They fear synthesis. They fear a narrative that connects motive, mechanism, and moral consequence into a single chain. That chain turns history into responsibility. And responsibility is what the system was designed to avoid. So imagine the researcher, historian, archivist, local scholar, journalist, who begins not with romance but with irritation. The story is famous, but the people are missing. The date is fixed, September 9th, 1739, but the roster dissolves. The origin is described, near the Stono River region, a store by a bridge, but the physical landscape is treated inconsistently over time. The aftermath is acknowledged, suppression, executions, fear, but the accounting remains vague. Every one of those vaguenesses is a signal flare, and the researcher starts doing what institutions hate: cross-referencing. Bull's letter is read against the anonymous account. Both are read against subsequent legal texts, especially the 1740 Slave Code. The researcher asks a simple prosecutorial question: what did the colony do with what it learned? And the answer is not hidden at all. It's written in law. In 1740, South Carolina's Negro Act codifies sweeping restrictions on movement, assembly, and autonomy. You could call it governance. But it reads like a post-trauma security upgrade aimed at preventing another Stono. That's the hinge. Stono is not merely an event, it's a justification. The law is the institutional afterimage of fear. But the private archive is not only the official documents. It is also the human archive that official documents try to treat as rumor. Spanish Florida as sanctuary. Fort Mose established by 1738 near St. Augustine as a fortified free black community aligned with Spain, the very existence of a destination that made marching south rational. That context transforms the rebellion's meaning. Without it, Stono can be framed as chaos. With it, Stono becomes strategy. And strategy is dangerous because it implies the enslaved were acting with political intent rather than blind rage. Institutions are comfortable condemning violence. They are less comfortable acknowledging rational resistance, because rational resistance implies moral guilt on the part of the system being resisted. This is the work of the private archive. It reunites what power scattered. It pulls law, letters, geography, and memory into one line of causality. It builds a two archives model: the official archive that records threat, and the human archive that records motive and survival logic. The researcher gathers oral histories where they exist, local traditions, regional mapping, the history of commemoration, markers, National Register documents, preservation debates, anything that shows how the story has been managed. And management is the key word. Because once you have enough evidence, you begin to see not just what happened in 1739, but what happened to the story afterward. You see how the colony's language persists. You see how the event is told as a warning rather than a memorial. You see how names remain thin. You see how the public is invited to know Stono without being asked to remember the dead as individuals. That is what a private archive tries to correct. Not by inventing, but by refusing to let gaps become excuses. And then comes the institutional pushback, the part that is never announced as censorship because censorship sounds ugly. It's announced as professionalism. It's announced as standards. It's announced as balance. The researcher drafts a manuscript, a report, a public history proposal, a museum narrative, something coherent. And somewhere in that coherence is the section institutions always dislike. The part that names a mission as policy. The part that says the lack of names is not an accident. The part that treats the 1740 Code not as history, but as an admission of institutional intent to suppress autonomy. the part that frames commemoration without full accounting as a continuation of the old erasure. This is the part that triggers the quiet response. Remove that section, soften that language. Don't make it too accusatory. Don't imply the founders' wealth was maintained by a terror regime. Don't frame the colony as a machine of extraction that needed laws like shackles. Keep it educational. Keep it neutral. Neutrality, here, is just obedience to the archive written by power. This is where the private archive becomes tragic. Because the researcher is not fighting a single censor. They are fighting the dependency structure of scholarship and public history. Access, funding, publication, reputation. An institution does not have to ban your work. It can simply deny you the platform. It can deny you the archive hours. It can deny you the grant. It can deny you the press. It can say, politely, we can support this project if it stays within certain parameters. That's not a threat in the courtroom sense. It is a threat in the livelihood sense. And most people, being human, have bills, families, careers. So they capitulate, not because they are evil, but because the system is designed to make capitulation the rational choice. This is how silence becomes self-sustaining across generations. By making truth economically fragile. So the researcher cuts the section. Or they dilute it. Or they publish a version that keeps the event, but reduces the indictment. And then they do the thing that creates the private archive. They keep the deleted pages. They save the draft. They put the sharper language in a box. They annotate a margin with what they could not print. They keep photocopies of documents that might later become hard to access. They keep a personal folder labeled something bland, Stono Notes, because bland labels are sometimes the only way to hide truth in plain sight. This is not melodrama. It is how inconvenient history survives in hostile environments. Truth becomes contraband. And contraband survives in private hands. Now, the narrator's duty here is to name the hinge with moral clarity. This is where the story could have become public accountability, and instead it became scattered memory. Not because evidence was absent, but because the institution made coherence costly. The tragedy is not that no one knew. The tragedy is that knowing was not permitted to become consequence. That is the difference between information and justice. Information can be tolerated. Justice cannot. And then we enter the modern technical report phase, the part where the language becomes clean again, sterile, scientific, and therefore deceptively persuasive. This is where institutions perfect their method. They stop saying, "Don't look," and start saying, "We recommend against excavation." They stop saying silence and start saying sensitivity. They stop saying cover-up and start saying best practices. In the modern era, you will see this in the way sites associated with painful histories are handled. Assessments, surveys, preservation plans, integrity evaluations, limited disturbance, respect for remains, community consultation. Some of this language is ethically necessary, yes. But in a story like Stono, you must also see how easily ethical language becomes a shield against deeper inquiry. Do not disturb can be a principle of respect. It can also be a principle of avoidance. And the only way to tell the difference is to ask, what accompanies the recommendation? Is there a commitment to naming? A commitment to accountability? A commitment to full public truth? Or is there only the request for quiet? This is what continuity looks like. In 1739, the colony's problem is immediate. Armed marchers, Killings. Panic. It responds with force. By 1740, it responds with law, structural suppression. In the modern era, it responds with procedure, technical language that manages public exposure. The vocabulary shifts, but the reflex remains. Minimize disturbance, control narrative, avoid obligations. The modern report does not need to lie. It only needs to focus on risk and omit moral urgency. It only needs to treat the past as a sensitive matter rather than an unresolved ledger. It needs to treat evidence as a preservation problem rather than an accountability problem. So imagine the modern document. A survey that notes anomalies, a preservation file that acknowledges the historical importance of a location, a recommendation that excavation or intrusive investigation is not advised. The public hears caution, professionalism, respect. But the buried record lens hears something else. The same choice repeating, dressed in updated terms. In the 18th century, the colony managed the story by erasing names and codifying control. In later decades, institutions manage it by certifying significance while keeping the public narrative thin. And in modern technical language, they manage it by prioritizing stability over truth, by treating disturbance as the enemy rather than the method by which buried evidence is finally confronted. Here is the prosecutorial line that ties the private archive to the modern report. The archive is not only what is stored, it is what is permitted to matter. A technical report can acknowledge a site's sensitivity without ever naming the people erased by that sensitivity. It can recommend caution without committing to reconstruction of names. It can preserve ground while allowing memory to remain unaccounted for. That is not respect. That is preservation of comfort. And comfort has always been the colony's priority. So what do we do with this? We separate the legitimate ethical concerns from the institutional reflex to avoid. Respect for remains is real. But respect without naming is incomplete. Sensitivity is real. But sensitivity used to suppress inquiry is a weapon. Do not disturb may prevent harm to evidence, but it can also prevent evidence from becoming public responsibility. The researcher's private archive exists precisely because public institutions repeatedly choose containment over consequence. The private archive is the moral rebellion of paper, the refusal to let the institution's preferred version become the final version. And this is where the narrator must speak directly, with that slight moral sermon you asked for, because a story like this is not entertainment. It is an accounting exercise. If you listen to Stono as a thrilling incident and then move on, you are doing what the colony trained the world to do. Treat Black resistance as spectacle and Black death as background. But if you insist on the private archive, if you insist on the deleted pages, the uncomfortable synthesis, the linkage between 1739 and 1740 and modern management, then you are refusing to inherit silence as your role. Remembering is not passive. Remembering is a demand. And the modern technical report language, for all its polish, cannot be allowed to become the final word if it functions as a barrier to that demand. Because the most damning continuity is this. The system that once called human beings property now calls their history sensitive and expects sensitivity to mean quiet. But sensitivity should mean the opposite. It should mean careful truth-telling. It should mean meticulous naming. It should mean refusing to let the past be cleaned into a brochure. The private archive exists to force that refusal into the open. And the modern report, when read critically, is not the end of the story. It is another receipt, proof that the instinct to avoid disturbance still lives, still breathes, still writes polite sentences to protect an old comfort. Now we close the file the way a real investigation closes it. Not with comforting certainty, but with disciplined separation, what we can prove, what we can infer, and what remains unknown not because it is unknowable, but because someone chose to make it so. That choice is the true antagonist here. Not a single man, not a single night. A choice repeated from 1739 into the present. Protect the institution, spend the people, and then manage the memory like hazardous waste. What we can prove is already enough to indict the system. The date is not negotiable. Sunday, September 9, 1739. The place is not fictional. The Stono River region in South Carolina, associated in the surviving accounts with a store near a bridge where weapons were seized. The sequence is not myth. A group, often described as roughly 20 at the start, armed themselves, killed at least some colonists in the initial strike, and marched south, recruiting as they moved. The colony's response is not rumor. Alarm was raised, militia confronted them, and the rebellion was suppressed with lethal force. In the weeks that followed, punishment escalated into executions, and terror meant to discipline the living. And the paper record confirms that the colony treated this not as a moral warning about the brutality of bondage, but as a security failure demanding stronger restraints. That is why October 5th, 1739 matters. Lieutenant Governor William Bull writes upward, packaging the uprising as a threat that must be answered. And that is why 1740 matters even more. South Carolina codifies the tightening of the cage, restrictions on movement, assembly, and autonomy under the banner of governance. The timeline is clear. The institutional learning is clear. The fear is clear. The aftermath is policy. We can also prove context that the official story often tries to treat as secondary, because it makes the uprising legible rather than monstrous. Spanish Florida existed as a rival jurisdiction that offered a plausible horizon for escape, and by 1738, Fort Mose existed near St. Augustine as a fortified free black settlement aligned with Spain. That reality matters because it transforms the march south from madness into strategy. A strategy does not erase the violence that occurred, but it does expose the lie at the heart of the colonial framing. That enslaved people acted without reason, as if cruelty alone were sufficient explanation. No, reason existed, because alternatives existed, and the enslaved knew it. That is what terrified the colony most. Not the gun, but the idea of a destination. Not the death, but the possibility of life outside the system. Now, what we can infer, carefully, and with prosecutorial discipline, is equally damning, because the inference is supported by multiple independent threads. Official accounts, legal response, and the structure of erasure itself. We can infer that Stono was not a spontaneous, isolated breakdown of order, but a symptom of systemic conditions. Because you don't get organized movement without networks. You don't get recruitment without social ties. You don't get direction without motive. And you do not get a sweeping legal crackdown in 1740 unless the colony believed the underlying conditions could produce repetition. Laws are not written for lightning strikes. Laws are written for patterns. The 1740 Code is a pattern response. It is the colony admitting, in bureaucratic form, that enslaved people were a population capable of coordination, and that the colony's solution was to criminalize the infrastructure of coordination, gathering, travel, communication, and autonomy. We can infer, too, that the record's thinness regarding individual identities is not a neutral archival accident. It functions too consistently as a shield. Officials are named. Titles are preserved. The colony remembers itself with clarity. The enslaved are aggregated into categories and totals. This asymmetry is not simply the style of the era. It is a political practice. Names create obligations. Names create sympathy. Names create demands for accounting. A slave society cannot afford a public ledger of the people it destroys, because a ledger would force the colony to confront its own human cost. So the system learns to record black life as a unit of labor, black death as an outcome of procedure, and black resistance as a threat requiring suppression. That is what silence as policy looks like on paper. Not blankness, but selective precision. And now we arrive at what remains unknown. Not because the truth cannot be approached, but because it was made expensive. The full roster of participants, who marched willingly, who was coerced, who was forced along the road, who tried to resist the march itself, is not preserved in a single authoritative list. The precise number of deaths, especially among the enslaved, is not recorded with the clarity that would exist if those lives were valued as lives rather than losses. Burial details, the locations, the handling of bodies, the individual fates after capture, remain fragmented, scattered, or absent. These are not small gaps. They are moral gaps. And they exist because in 1739 and 1740 the colony's priority was never the sanctity of truth. It was the restoration of control and the prevention of future coordination. The same logic that wrote the code also shaped what was remembered. Preserve what protects the system. Let the rest fade. So here is the resolution in the only form it deserves. The case does not end with a comforting answer. It ends with a verdict about institutional behavior. The colony responded to Stono by tightening bondage, not loosening it. It responded by restricting human life, not recognizing human rights. It responded by turning fear into law. And then it relied on a record-keeping style that reduced the enslaved to a mass, making it easier for future generations to talk about the uprising without being forced to remember the people inside it. This is the moral truth the receipts point to. Institutional reputation and stability were protected at human cost. Not once. Systematically. Now return to the cold open. Return to the ground. Return to the modern moment where people point at a marker, a site description, a preserved summary, and call that remembrance. Look at what we have learned and see the insult more clearly. The landscape is easier to certify than the lives are to reconstruct. We can say Stono and feel educated. We can say 1739 and feel informed. We can recite largest uprising before the revolution and feel that we have done our duty. But duty is not recitation. Duty is accounting. Duty is refusing to let totals replace names. Duty is treating the gaps as evidence of violence, not as excuses for silence. So what do we do with a story whose archive was designed to prevent full remembrance? We do what the institution did not want. We build a list from fragments, even if incomplete, especially if incomplete. We hold on to the few names that survive in the record, Jemmy, Cato, the names of officials like William Bull, not to elevate the powerful, but to expose the imbalance. We say, look how easily power preserves itself. Look how easily it forgets the dead. We map the route not as a thrilling march, but as a trail of human decisions under terror. We speak the date, September 9th, 1739, like an indictment, not a trivia answer. We speak 1740 like a confession written in law. A society that responds to resistance by outlawing community is admitting it knows community is the enemy of slavery. And we speak 1738, Fort Mose, as the proof that hope was not imaginary, that the desire for freedom had a real geographic shape. And now the closing, because every buried record narrative must end with something that refuses to disappear. Not a neat twist. A symbol that functions like a splinter under the skin. For Stono, the symbol is the disparity between the boldness of the event and the thinness of the human ledger. A rebellion famous enough to be taught, but still too inconvenient to be fully memorialized. A place marked, but not fully protected. A story repeated, but not fully reckoned. That disparity is the thing that should keep you awake, because it reveals how a society can remember while still obeying the original command. Do not count them as people. So here is the final moral instruction, delivered without softness. If you inherit a history of erased names and you treat that erasure as normal, you become a collaborator with time. You let the institution win again. But if you treat missing names as an emergency, if you treat missing pages as evidence of intent, then you are refusing the colony's final demand. The colony demanded silence. The colony demanded that the dead remain anonymous. The colony demanded that the story remain useful as a warning, not sacred as a memorial. Our responsibility is to violate that demand. To keep asking the dangerous question, where did they go, until the question itself becomes a form of remembrance. Because this is what Stono ultimately exposes. Slavery was not only a labor system, it was a memory system. It trained society to see certain lives as unworthy of record. And when those lives erupted into history on September 9th, 1739, the colony answered by tightening the cage in 1740 and tightening the narrative forever after. So if you're listening from somewhere far from South Carolina, don't comfort yourself by calling this their past. Ask what your own institutions have buried. Ask what your own archives call sensitive. Ask what your own public memory reduces to a marker instead of a ledger. And now I'll ask you to do the simplest thing that powerful systems hate. Locate yourself. If you're listening from a place built on forced labor, on erased names, on bodies counted as inventory, say where you're from. Put your location in the comments. Not as a roll call for tourism, but as a confession that no one is outside history's accounting. And if you have theories, bring them like evidence, not like entertainment. Receipts first. Names when possible. Dates always. Because in a story like this, the final crime is not only what happened in 1739. The final crime is what we allow ourselves to forget in 2026. 6.